On the night of the company's 50th anniversary, my father patted my shoulder in front of 500 elites and called me a replaceable rusty screw. My half-brother smirked, claiming I would not last 1 week without their money. I said nothing. I just placed my security badge on the table and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. They think they exiled a useless son, but they actually removed the safety key from the nuclear bomb they are sitting on. My name is Robert Johnson. I am not a Sterling, despite the fact that the blood running through my veins is identical to the man standing on the podium. My father, Richard Sterling, made sure to legally change my last name to my mother's maiden name when I was 8 years old. He claimed it was to honor her memory after she passed, but even as a child, I knew the truth. He was rebranding his life, scrubbing away the parts that did not fit the glossy, high society image he was building for Vanguard Global Logistics. I was the son of his first struggling years, the reminder of a time when he drove trucks rather than owned fleets of them. I was the operational prototype, rugged and functional. Julian, my half-brother, born to his second wife, Eleanor, was the luxury model. Tonight was the 50th anniversary of Vanguard Global Logistics. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel in Chicago was suffocatingly opulent. The ceiling was hidden behind cascades of imported crystals that caught the light of 1,000 candles. The air smelled of expensive lilies, roasted duck, and old money. 500 of the most influential people in Illinois were packed into the room, their laughter tinkling like broken glass. I stood near a marble pillar, swirling a glass of sparkling water I had no intention of drinking. I wore a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, yet I felt like a mechanic who had wandered into a royal court. Richard stood center stage, basking in the applause. He looked good for a man of 65. His hair was silver and perfectly coiffed. His smile practiced in front of mirrors for decades. Beside him stood Eleanor, draped in emeralds that looked heavy enough to snap her neck, and Julian. My brother Julian looked like a model from a magazine, if that model had not slept in 3 days and was vibrating from a cocktail of prescription uppers and top-shelf scotch. He was 30 years old and had never worked a full 8-hour shift in his life. I watched them, my face a mask of professional neutrality. I was the chief operating officer of this empire. I was the one who optimized the supply chains when the Suez Canal was blocked. I was the one who digitized our entire warehousing system while Richard was golfing in the Hamptons. I was the one who stayed in the office until 3 a.m, 7 days a week for 15 years. Richard tapped the microphone, the feedback whined, silencing the room. Tonight is not just about looking back at 50 years of excellence. Richard boomed, his voice rich and baritone. It is about looking forward. It is about the legacy of the Sterling name. The crowd murmured appreciatively. I straightened my tie. We had discussed this. I was supposed to be announced as the new CEO tonight. It was the natural progression. Richard would become chairman, and I would take the wheel. I had written the transition plan myself. A legacy needs a visionary. Richard continued, his eyes scanning the room, sliding right past me, as if I were part of the architecture. And I am proud to announce that effective immediately, the role of Chief Executive Officer will be filled by my son, Julian Sterling. The applause was polite, but confused. A few heads turned in my direction. I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest, like liquid nitrogen filling my lungs. I did not move. And Richard raised a hand to silence the whispers. We must not forget those who serve the family. Robert Johnson. He said my name like it was a clerical error. Robert will be taking on a new critical challenge. He will be relocating to Anchorage, Alaska, to oversee our northern storage facility. We need a steady hand to manage the inventory there. Let us give him a round of applause for his sacrifice. The humiliation was surgical. He was not just firing me. He was exiling me. He was demoting the man who built the company's nervous system to a glorified warehouse guard in the frozen tundra. Julian took the microphone. He looked high, his eyes manic and bright. He laughed a wet, sloppy sound. "Thanks, Dad. And, hey, Robert." Julian pointed at me, his finger wavering. "Don't freeze out there, big brother." Although, let's be honest, he leaned into the mic, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that echoed through the hall. "You step out of this family's shadow, and you wouldn't last 1 week. You're just a rusty screw we finally replaced." The room went deadly silent. 500 pairs of eyes bored into me. They expected a scene. They expected the overlooked son to scream, to cry, to beg. I did none of those things. I walked toward the head table. The sound of my dress shoes on the marble floor was the only noise in the room. I stopped in front of Richard and Julian. My father looked at me with a mixture of challenge and amusement. Julian was smirking, waiting for me to crack. I reached into my inner jacket pocket. Richard flinched, perhaps thinking I had a weapon. I pulled out my security badge. It was a level 10 access card, the highest clearance. The only card that could override the biometric locks on the server rooms. I placed it gently on the white tablecloth. Next, I fished the keys to the company Mercedes from my pocket. I placed them next to the badge. Finally, I took out the company-issued smartphone, the device that tethered me to Vanguard 24 hours a day. I set it down. The 3 items formed a neat little triangle of surrender. I looked Richard in the eye. "Good luck," I said. My voice was even devoid of anger. It was the tone of a doctor pronouncing a time of death. I turned and walked away. "That's it!" Julian shouted after me, his voice cracking. "Walk away, loser. 1 week, I give you 1 week before you're begging for a check." I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the lobby, then through the revolving doors into the night. The Chicago winter hit me instantly. The wind was howling off Lake Michigan, carrying a temperature of 20 degrees below zero. It bit through my tuxedo, instantly stinging my skin. I had no coat. I had left it in the cloakroom, and I had no intention of going back for it. I had no car. I had no phone to call an Uber. I began to walk. The snow crunched under my thin leather soles. Most men would have felt fear. I had just walked away from a salary of $600,000 a year. I had walked away from my inheritance. I had walked away from the only life I had known since I was 22 years old. But as the icy wind froze the tears on my cheeks that I refused to shed, I felt something else. I felt lighter. Richard and Julian thought they were the engine of Vanguard. They thought the company ran on handshake deals and champagne toasts. They did not understand that Vanguard was a digital entity. It was lines of code, automated logistics, predictive algorithms, and server handshakes. And I had written every single line of it. They thought they had fired an employee. They did not realize they had just unplugged the server. I walked for 40 minutes. The blisteringly cold air cleared my head. I found myself in a grittier part of the city away from the glittering skyscrapers. I spotted a neon sign flickering in a basement window, the NetStop. It was a 24-hour internet cafe, a relic of a bygone era, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and instant noodles. I walked down the concrete steps and pushed open the door. The guy behind the counter, a teenager with purple hair and a nose ring, barely looked up from his comic book. $10 an hour, he mumbled. I reached into my pocket. I had my personal wallet. I pulled out a $20 bill and slapped it on the counter. "Give me 2 hours. And I need a terminal in the back. No cameras." He shrugged and tossed me a slip of paper with a login code. I sat down at a sticky cubicle in the far corner. The computer hummed loudly, the fan struggling to cool the dusty processor. It was a piece of junk compared to the quantum processing terminals I used at Vanguard, but it was connected to the internet. That was all I needed. I cracked my knuckles. My hands were shaking slightly from the cold, but as soon as my fingers touched the keyboard, they steadied. I was a pianist sitting down at his instrument. I did not hack Vanguard. You cannot hack something you built. I simply accessed the back door I had left open for myself on day one. It was a failsafe, a dead man's switch, designed for a scenario I had prayed would never happen, but had prepared for nonetheless. I navigated through a series of proxy servers, bouncing my signal from Chicago to Estonia, then to Singapore, and finally back to the private server farm in the basement of the Vanguard headquarters. I opened the command prompt. The screen was a comforting black void with a blinking green cursor. I typed in a single command line: execute ghost_protocol.bat. The system asked for a password. I typed it in without hesitation. It was the date my mother died. Access granted. Initiating system. Lockdown, 0%. Loading assets, removing user privileges. I watched the progress bar fill up. It took less than 30 seconds. When it reached 100%, I typed one final command: exit, and wipe trace. I sat back in the creaking chair. It was done. I had not destroyed the data. I was not a criminal. I had simply encrypted the interface. I had changed the language of the machine. The engine was still there, but the steering wheel was gone, and I was the only one who knew where I had thrown the key. I stood up, leaving $18.50 worth of computer time unused. I walked out of the cafe and found a cheap motel 2 blocks down. I paid cash for a room that smelled of bleach and regret. I lay down on the lumpy mattress, still in my tuxedo, and fell into the deepest sleep of my life. I woke up the next morning to the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. I stretched my back, popping. For the first time in 15 years, I did not have to check my email. I did not have to worry about the Asian markets opening. But across town at the Sterling Manor, the morning was unfolding very differently. Richard Sterling woke up at 7 o'clock sharp, as he always did. He reached for the tablet on his bedside table to open the automated blinds and check the stock market. The screen was black. He tapped it. Nothing. He grumbled and got out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floor. The radiant floor heating was off. In fact, the room was freezing. He walked to the window and tried to pull the heavy velvet drapes open manually. They were stuck. The electronic tracks had locked into the safety position. He marched to the door to yell for the maid. The door handle wouldn't turn. The smart lock, designed to keep intruders out, was now keeping him in. "Eleanor," he shouted, "the damn house is broken!" From the hallway, he heard Julian screaming, Dad, I'm stuck in the elevator. Stuck in." "The lights are off and it's getting hot in here." Richard pounded on his bedroom door. "Open this door, voice command override." A pleasant, synthetic voice echoed from the ceiling speakers. It was a voice I had programmed myself, using a synthesized version of a British butler. "I am sorry, Richard," the voice said politely. "Access denied. Current administrator privileges have been revoked. Please contact the system architect for assistance." "Who is the system architect?" Richard screamed, his breath visible in the freezing room. "The system architect is Robert Johnson," the voice replied smoothly. "Would you like to leave a message?" Richard stared at the speaker. The realization hit him harder than the cold. He ran to his bathroom, to splash water on his face to wake himself up from this nightmare. He turned the gold-plated faucet. Nothing came out but a sad, hollow hiss of air. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the motel, eating a stale donut I had bought from the vending machine. I imagined the scene perfectly. The Sterling Manor was a fortress of technology. It controlled the climate, the locks, the water pressure, the security gates, and even the coffee maker. And now it was a high-tech prison. I took a bite of the donut. It tasted like victory. Julian had said I wouldn't last 1 week without them. He was wrong. The real question was how long they would last without me. They were trapped in a box of their own making, and I was the only one who knew the combination. The war had begun, and the first shot had been fired in silence. I sat on a folding chair in a studio apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old carpet. It was located in the shadow of the interstate, a place where the sirens never stopped, and the sun struggled to cut through the smog. My dinner was a cup of instant noodles that cost 45 cents. I peeled back the foil lid, the steam rising into the cold air of the room. It was the best meal I had eaten in years, because it was seasoned with the absolute, unadulterated misery of my family. On the desk in front of me, a laptop rigged with a high-gain antenna was humming. The screen was divided into a grid of 16 smaller windows. They were the live feeds from the security cameras inside Sterling Manor. I had installed them myself 3 years ago. Richard had wanted them for security to keep the poor people out. Now, they were broadcasting a reality show where the rich people were locked in. In the top left quadrant, I watched my father. Richard Sterling, a man who had not opened a door for himself since the late 90s, was currently wrapped in a $3,000 cashmere blanket, shivering violently. The smart home system, the crown jewel of his estate, had decided that the optimal temperature for the household was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Richard was screaming at a wall-mounted control panel. I could not hear the audio, but I could read his lips perfectly. He was cursing my name. He pounded his fist against the sleek glass interface, but the screen remained dark, displaying only a single, mocking icon, a snowflake. In the bottom right quadrant, the fire department was prying open the elevator doors on the second floor. Julian stumbled out looking like a rat that had been drowned in a bucket of sweat. He had been trapped in there for 4 hours. His designer suit was soaked through his hair, was plastered to his forehead, and he was hyperventilating. The moment he stepped onto the landing, he slipped on the polished marble floor, because the humidity control system had pumped the hallway full of tropical moisture, turning the expensive stone into an ice rink. I took a slurp of my noodles. The broth was salty and hot. I watched as Eleanor, my stepmother, stormed down the grand staircase, wrapped in a fur coat. She was holding her phone up in the air frantically, trying to find a signal. She would not find one. I had engaged the local signal jammer integrated into the home security network. It was designed to prevent burglars from calling for backup, but right now it was preventing Eleanor from calling her personal stylist to complain about the cold. They were helpless. For decades they had relied on the invisible labor of others to maintain their paradise. They never asked how the heat worked, how the lights turned on, or how the water got hot. They just expected it to be there like gravity. I had removed the gravity. The chaos at the manor was satisfying, but the real show was happening 10 miles away, at the headquarters of Vanguard Global Logistics. I switched tabs on my laptop, pulling up the internal dashboard of the V-Track system. Vanguard moved $2 billion worth of freight every year. We handled everything from medical supplies to automotive parts. The heart of the operation was V-Track, a proprietary software I had coded to manage the millions of QR codes that tracked every single container. On my screen, the dashboard was a sea of red warning lights. I tapped into the security feed of the main dispatch floor. It was pandemonium. Phones were ringing off the hook, a cacophony of shrill demands that no one could answer. The dispatchers, men and women who usually worked with military precision, were standing on their desks, shouting at each other. "The codes are scrambling!" one guy yelled, waving a scanner. "Every time I scan a pallet, it comes up as an error." "I have 20 trucks backed up at Gate 4, another shouted. "The drivers are threatening to leave. They can't load without a manifest." Julian, having barely recovered from his elevator ordeal, burst into the office an hour later. He was still wearing his ruined suit. He looked wild-eyed. He marched into the server room, followed by the terrified head of IT, a guy named Gary who was competent but spineless. "Fix it!" Julian screamed, pointing at the main server banks. "Just reboot it. Turn it off and turn it on again." "We tried that, sir," Gary stammered. "We tried it 3 times. The system is locked at the BIOS level. We need the administrator password to override the encryption." "Then type it in," Julian roared. "We don't know it, sir," Gary said, his voice trembling. "Mr. Johnson never wrote it down. He said it was a rolling algorithmic key that changed every 24 hours. He was the only one who received the daily code." Julian froze. He stared at the blinking lights of the server towers. Those lights represented millions of dollars burning by the minute. Every hour the trucks sat idle. Vanguard lost roughly $50,000 in penalties. "Call him," Julian whispered. Then he screamed, "Call him right now!" I watched as Julian pulled out his phone. Julian pulled. My burner phone, sitting on the desk next to my noodles, remained silent. I had already deactivated my official number. He was calling a ghost. While Julian was melting down in the server room, Eleanor was facing her own personal apocalypse in downtown Chicago. I did not have cameras in the Lumiere Spa, but I could imagine the scene vividly, because I had access to the financial transaction logs. Eleanor went to the spa every Tuesday at 10 in the morning for a diamond dust facial that cost $800. It was her ritual. She would walk in, treat the staff like furniture, and demand absolute silence. I refreshed the banking window. Transaction declined, Lumiere Spa. Amount $850. Transaction declined, Lumiere Spa. Amount $850. Transaction declined, Lumiere Spa. Amount $50. She had tried to split the payment. She had tried to put it on 3 different cards. All of them were black Amex Centurion cards, symbols of limitless wealth. And I had frozen every single one of them. Technically, I did not have the authority to freeze personal accounts. But Richard, in his infinite laziness, had linked all family accounts to the corporate expense server to maximize tax write-offs. He had classified his wife's facials as client relations. By locking the corporate finance node, I had inadvertently, or perhaps very intentionally, guillotined their personal spending power. I pictured Eleanor, standing at the reception desk, her face covered in cream, the receptionist looking at her with that polite, pitying smile that service workers reserve for broke customers. "I am sorry, Mrs. Sterling," the girl would say. "Do you have another form of payment? Perhaps cash?" Eleanor never carried cash. Cash was for peasants. Back at the Sterling Manor, Richard had finally managed to break a window with a heavy bronze statue to get some fresh air, or rather some air that wasn't statically controlled. He was shivering, wrapped in his blanket, holding a landline phone that was independent of the smart system. He was not calling me. He knew I wouldn't answer. He was calling the police. "He stole it," Richard was shouting into the receiver. I could hear the recording because I had tapped the landline years ago to monitor corporate espionage. My son, Robert Johnson. He walked out with a laptop belonging to Vanguard Global Logistics. It contains proprietary secrets. I want him arrested for grand larceny and corporate theft. I want a SWAT team. He was desperate. He thought that if he could get the cops to drag me back in handcuffs, he could force me to unlock the system. He thought the law was just another employee he could command. 40 minutes later, a squad car pulled up to my old apartment in the Gold Coast district. It was a beautiful penthouse I had lived in for 10 years. Richard paid the rent, of course, which was another leash he kept on me. I switched the camera feed to the interior of that penthouse. 2 officers kicked the door, open guns drawn. They moved tactically, checking the corners. "Clear," one shouted. "Clear," the other replied. They lowered their weapons and looked around. The apartment was empty, and I do not mean it was unoccupied. I mean it was void. There was no furniture. There were no clothes in the closet. There were no pictures on the walls. I had hired a professional cleaning crew 2 days before the party. They had scrubbed the floors, steam-cleaned the carpets, and wiped down every surface. There wasn't a fingerprint, a hair follicle, or a scrap of paper left. "Dispatch," the officer said into his radio, sounding confused. "There is nobody here. The place looks like it hasn't been lived in for months. No laptop, no suspect." Richard, listening on the other end, went silent. He realized then that this was not a tantrum. This was an evacuation. I hadn't just left. I had erased myself. I leaned back in my chair in the shabby studio, stretching my arms. The heat in the room was clanking noisily, a stark contrast to the silent, deadly cold of the manor. I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was not the burner phone I used for the family. It was a third phone, an old Nokia brick that I kept for emergencies of a different kind. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. I knew who it was. And I knew this was where the game stopped being funny and started being dangerous. Richard Sterling built his empire on logistics, but you do not become the king of shipping in Chicago without shaking hands with the devil. There were containers that moved through Vanguard's ports that were not on the official manifest. Containers that did not get scanned. Containers that held things much heavier and much more illegal than auto parts. I picked up the phone. "Mr. Johnson," a voice rasped. It sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. It was a voice from the Russian enclave in Brighton Beach, or maybe the Serbian underground. It didn't matter. It was the voice of a man who solved problems with lead, not lawsuits. "Speaking," I said calmly. "Your father," the voice said. "He is not answering his phone. And our shipment at Pier 39. It is stuck. The gate will not open. The code is invalid." "I am aware," I said. "We do not like delays, Mr. Johnson. The cargo is perishable, in a manner of speaking. If the gate does not open in 1 hour, we will come to your father's house. And we will not knock." "My father is currently indisposed," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen where Richard was trying to light a fire in the decorative fireplace using architectural magazines. "But I suspect he will have a lot of free time to meet with you soon." "You are playing a game you do not understand," the man threatened. "No," I corrected him. "I am the only one who knows the rules. The system is down, gentlemen, and it stays down until I say otherwise. If you want your cargo, you talk to Richard. Tell him Robert sends his regards." I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I had just directed a pack of wolves toward the sheep pen. Richard wanted to play the tough guy. He wanted to act like a titan of industry. Let him deal with the real industry. I looked back at the screen. Julian was crying in the server room now, actually sobbing into his hands while the IT staff looked at their shoes awkwardly. Eleanor was likely screaming at a cab driver because she couldn't pay the fare. And Richard was staring at the unlit logs in his fireplace, realizing that he didn't know how to start a fire without a gas starter that was controlled by an app. They were freezing. They were broke. They were under siege. And I had another bowl of noodles to make. The engine of my rental car, a beat-up sedan that smelled of stale cigarettes, rattled as I drove away from the city. The chaos I had unleashed at Sterling Manor was growing in the rearview mirror, but my destination lay in the opposite direction. To understand the future I was building, I had to revisit the past. I had to visit the man who had actually built the foundation. People thought Richard Sterling was the genius behind Vanguard. They saw his face on the magazine covers. They heard his booming voice at the charity galas. But Richard could not tell the difference between a server rack and a toaster. The real mind, the true architect, was his older brother, my uncle Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the ghost in the machine long before I took on the role. He was a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a mind that moved in binary code. He had died 10 years ago, a heart attack at his desk, while Richard was vacationing in the Maldives. Richard had shed a few crocodile tears at the funeral, buried Arthur in a modest plot, and then immediately claimed Arthur's patents as his own. Or so he thought. I pulled the car up to a rusted chain-link fence on the outskirts of Chicago. The sign above the gate flickered with a dying neon buzz, ironclad self-storage. It was a graveyard for forgotten things, old furniture tax records, broken dreams. I punched a code into the keypad. The gate groaned open. I drove to Unit 404. The number was a private joke between Arthur and me. Error 404, not found. I rolled up the metal door. The air inside was dry and smelled of dust and old paper. There was nothing in the unit except a single, heavy fireproof filing cabinet in the center of the concrete floor. I approached it, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I did not need a key. I knew the combination. It was the date Richard had fired Arthur from the board of directors 20 years ago, a date Arthur had never forgotten. I spun the dial. Click. The drawer slid open on well-oiled tracks. Inside, there was a single thick envelope sealed with wax. I picked it up. My hands trembled slightly. This was the shadow will. Arthur had known. He had seen the greed growing in Richard's eyes like a cancer. He knew that one day Richard would turn on me, just as he had turned on everyone else. So Arthur had prepared a failsafe. I broke the seal and pulled out the documents. They were legal papers, yellowed with age but ironclad in their authority. I read the cover page aloud to the empty room. Intellectual property assignment and licensing agreement. Subject, the source code and algorithmic architecture, known as VTrack. Owner, RJ Solutions LLC. Sole proprietor, Robert Johnson. A grim smile touched my lips. Richard believed that Vanguard owned VTrack. He believed that because the software ran on Vanguard servers, it belonged to the company. But Arthur had been smarter. He had written the core code, the unchangeable DNA of the system, under a separate entity. He had registered the copyright in his name and then transferred that ownership to a shell company, RJ Solutions. I was RJ Solutions. Vanguard Global Logistics did not own its operating system. For the past 15 years, they had been operating on a lease that I could terminate at any moment for violation of terms. And Richard shouting at me in front of 500 people was definitely a violation of terms. I closed the file. The legal reality was now clear. I was not an employee sabotaging a company. I was a landlord evicting a bad tenant. I drove back to my grim little apartment with the documents on the passenger seat. I felt Arthur's presence with me. He was the one who had taught me to code. He was the one who told me that a company is just a fiction, but a system is a reality. When I opened the door to my room, the laptop on the desk was screaming. A red alert banner was flashing across the screen. Intrusion detected. Unauthorized access attempt. Source, IP masked. I sat down, my senses sharpening. Richard had made his move. He evidently could not get the police to break down my door, and he could not get the IT department to crack the encryption. So he had gone to the dark side. He had hired mercenaries. I analyzed the attack vector. It was aggressive and messy. Brute force attacks combined with a sophisticated SQL injection script. This was not the work of a script kiddie. This was expensive talent. Probably a black hat group from Eastern Europe hired through an intermediary. Richard was burning through his secret cash reserves to pay for this. He was desperate to get the trucks moving before the clients sued him into oblivion. I watched the lines of code scrolling down the terminal. They were hammering at the firewall, looking for a weak point. They wanted the master keys. They wanted the administrator passwords to reboot VTrack. I could have blocked them. I could have simply severed the connection and left them grasping at air. But that would have been too easy. That would have been defense. I wanted to play offense. "You want the keys to the castle," I whispered to the screen. "Fine, I will leave the door unlocked." I quickly coded a honeypot. It is a digital trap, a decoy server that looks exactly like the real database, but is actually an isolated sandbox. Inside this trap, I placed a file named master_admin_reset_codes.exe. It looked like the Holy Grail. To a hacker under pressure from a screaming billionaire, it would look like a mistake I had made in my haste. I lowered the firewall just a fraction, a tiny crack in the armor. The hackers took the bait instantly. The intrusion indicators flared red. They were inside. They saw the file. I could practically hear their cheers of victory across the ocean. Downloading 100%. They grabbed the file. They disconnected, thinking they had won. They would now be sending that file directly to Richard's personal terminal, telling him to run it to unlock the system. I leaned back and interlaced my fingers behind my head. The file was not a password reset. It was a mirror virus. The moment Richard or Julian or whoever was manning the one working laptop in Sterling Manor ran that file, it would not unlock V-Track. Instead, it would execute a script I had named the confessional. The virus was designed to scour the local hard drive and the cloud accounts linked to the user. It specifically looked for encrypted folders, incognito browsing history, and offshore transaction receipts. It then compiled them into a very readable, very colorful PDF document. And then, it would auto-email that document to every contact in the address book labeled Family. I switched my view back to the security cameras at Sterling Manor. It was evening now. The house was still freezing lit only by emergency mood lighting, which cast long, eerie shadows. Richard was sitting at the dining table wrapped in a duvet. He had a laptop open in front of him. He was on the phone, likely with the hackers. "I have it," Richard said. I could read the relief on his face. "I am running the executable now. You guys are worth every penny." He hit the enter key. I held my breath. On Richard's screen, a green bar would be loading. He probably thought it was the system restoring itself. Suddenly, Richard frowned. He tapped the screen. The green bar disappeared, replaced by a large, cheerful image of a clown holding a sign that said, "Surprise." Simultaneously across the table, Eleanor's phone pinged. The sound was loud in the silent, cold room. Eleanor, who was nursing a glass of wine and looking miserable, picked up her phone. "Who is emailing me at this hour?" she muttered. She tapped the screen. I watched her face. First there was confusion. She squinted at the small screen. Then, her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The document she was reading contained transcripts of Richard's chats with a 22-year-old model named Inez in Monaco. It contained receipts for a diamond necklace purchased last week, a necklace Eleanor had never received. It contained the blueprints for a villa Richard was building in the Caribbean, a villa that had only one master bedroom. And most damning of all, it contained a transfer order dated for next month. A transfer of $10 million from the Joint Family Trust to a private account in the Cayman Islands, effectively leaving Eleanor with nothing but the clothes on her back. Richard was still tapping his laptop. "It is not working," he shouted into the phone. "Nothing is happening. It just shows a damn clown." Eleanor slowly lowered her phone. The expression on her face was not human. It was the look of a wild animal that realizes it has been trapped in a cage and decides to eat the zookeeper. "Richard," she said. Her voice was low, trembling, with a frequency that could shatter glass. Richard looked up annoyed. "Not now, Eleanor. I am trying to save the company." "You bought her a villa," Eleanor whispered. Richard froze. "What Inez?" Eleanor said the name coming out like a curse. "You bought that little tart a villa in St. Bart's. With my money. With the trust fund money." Richard's face went pale. "Eleanor, I don't know what you are talking about. You are hysterical." "And you were going to leave me," she continued, standing up. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She did not seem to feel the cold anymore. The rage was keeping her warm. "Next month, you were going to file for divorce and leave me with zero. It is all here, Richard. Every email, every receipt." "That is a lie," Richard stammered, standing up to back away. "It is a fabrication. It is Robert. He faked it." "These are your bank statements," Eleanor screamed. She threw her phone at him. It struck him in the chest and clattered to the floor. "These are your signatures." Eleanor lunged across the table. She was not a fighter. She was a socialite who had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne flute. But betrayal is a powerful steroid. She grabbed a heavy silver candelabra. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked, swinging the silver weapon. Richard ducked, covering his head. "Eleanor, stop. I can explain." "Explain the necklace," a crash. The candelabra smashed into the expensive china, sending shards flying. "Explain the diamonds," Julian ran into the room, attracted by the noise. "Mom, Dad, what is happening?" "Your father is a thief," Eleanor yelled, turning on her son. "And you knew, didn't you? You little parasite, you knew he was stealing our money." "I didn't know anything," Julian cried, backing away. I sat in my apartment watching the feed. It was better than any movie. The great Sterling family. The pillars of Chicago society were tearing each other apart by candlelight while wearing blankets. Richard was cowering in the corner. Eleanor was destroying the dining room. Julian was weeping. The virus had done its job. I had not just locked the doors. I had turned the inmates against each other. I closed the laptop lid. The hunger in my stomach was gone. I looked over at the pile of documents from Uncle Arthur. "You were right, Uncle Arthur," I said to the empty room. They didn't own any of it. Not the company. Not the money. And certainly not each other. The internal collapse had begun. They were too busy fighting a civil war to notice that outside the real enemy, the law, the shareholders, and the mob was gathering at the gates. I laid down on the hard mattress. Tomorrow, the physical world would come crashing down on them. Tonight, I would let them enjoy the hell they had created for themselves. I slept soundly, dreaming of code and fire. The digital war was over, but the kinetic war had just begun. I knew Richard Sterling better than anyone. I knew that when his intellect failed, he resorted to his checkbook. And when his checkbook failed to bribe someone, he used it to hurt them. He had realized that he could not outcode me, so he had decided to delete me. Physically. I was sitting in my rented sedan parked down the street from a pharmacy when I saw them. Two black SUVs with tinted windows, idling with a predatory patience. They were not police. Police have protocols. They have paperwork. These men had earpieces and the distinct, bulky posture of people wearing concealable body armor under cheap jackets. They were Blackwood. Blackwood was a private security firm, a polite euphemism for mercenaries who operated on domestic soil. Richard had used them before to break up union strikes at the docks in 2015. They charged $2,000 a day per operative, and they did not ask questions about civil rights. I slowly lowered my head, keeping my profile hidden. I was no longer Robert Johnson, the COO. I was a ghost. For the last 48 hours, I had been practicing the art of the gray man. It is a concept I learned from the security consultants I used to hire. The goal is not to hide in the shadows, but to disappear in plain sight. You wear boring clothes. You walk with average speed. You avoid eye contact. You become background noise. I had ditched my suit for a pair of faded jeans, a gray hoodie, and a nondescript canvas jacket I bought at a thrift store. I had shaved my head in a gas station bathroom, removing the distinctive hairstyle that had been on the company website for a decade. I cycled through burner phones every 6 hours, buying them with cash at different convenience stores and snapping them in half before tossing them into dumpsters. I watched in the rearview mirror as one of the Blackwood operatives got out of the SUV. He held a tablet. I knew what was on that screen: facial recognition software linked to the city's camera grid. Richard had likely paid a corrupt contact in the police department to feed my image into the system. I started the car and pulled away slowly, careful not to signal too abruptly. My heart was a cold stone in my chest. This was not a game of cat and mouse. It was a game of hunter and wolf. I needed to see what the world was saying about me. I drove to a crowded sports bar on the south side, a place where the floor was sticky with spilled beer, and the patrons were too focused on the hockey game to notice a bald man in the corner. I looked up at the row of televisions above the bar. One screen was showing a news network. The headline made my stomach turn. Fallen. Son, the mental breakdown of Robert Johnson. On the screen, Julian was sitting next to a sympathetic news anchor. He looked devastated. He was wearing a modest sweater, his eyes red-rimmed. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. "We are just so worried about him," Julian said, his voice trembling perfectly. "Robert has been under a lot of stress lately. He started talking about conspiracies about destroying the company. We tried to get him help, but he just snapped. He sabotaged the family business. He locked us out of our own home. We don't care about the money. We just want our brother to come home and get the psychiatric treatment he needs." "Hey." The anchor nodded solemnly. "Police are describing him as armed and dangerous, is that correct?" "He has access to dangerous technology," Julian lied smoothly. "And he has made threats against our father. Please, if you are watching this, Robert, just turn yourself in." I gripped my glass of water so hard I thought it might shatter. It was a masterstroke of public relations. Richard had spun the narrative. I was not the whistleblower exposing corruption. I was the unstable, jealous son having a psychotic break. The public would not see a hero. They would see a villain. I felt the eyes of the room on me. They weren't looking at me specifically, but the paranoia was creeping in. I left a $5 bill on the table and walked out the back exit. I needed help. I was cut off from my funds, my home, and my reputation. There was only one person in Chicago I could trust, and even that was a gamble. Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was the fiercest corporate litigator in the city. She was also the woman I had almost married 5 years ago before my obsession with Vanguard drove us apart. She hated Richard Sterling with a passion that rivaled my own. I used a payphone, one of the few left in the city, to call her private line. I let it ring once, hung up. Rang twice, hung up. Rang 3 times. It was our old signal. 20 minutes later, I was standing in the shadows of the lower level of a concrete parking garage near the courthouse. It was freezing, the wind howling through the open concrete slats. A silver Audi pulled in and parked in the darkest corner. Sarah stepped out. She looked impeccable in a trench coat, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. She didn't hug me when I stepped out. She just looked at my shaved head and my cheap clothes. "You look like hell, Robert," she said. "Nice to see you too, Sarah," I replied, my voice raspy. "Did anyone follow you?" "I took 3 detours. I'm clean," she said. She reached into her car and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "We don't have much time. Richard is moving fast." "I saw Julian on TV," I said. "They are playing the insanity card." "It is worse than that," Sarah said, her face grim. "I have a friend in the district attorney's office. Richard filed a formal complaint this morning. He is accusing you of embezzling $50 million over the last 10 years. He has paper trails, Robert. Fake invoices, doctored wire transfers, all signed with your digital signature." I let out a bitter laugh. "He is framing me for the money he stole." "It is smart," Sarah admitted. "If you try to release the evidence of his smuggling now, it will look like a desperate attempt to distract from your own crimes. He is destroying your credibility before you even open your mouth. If the police catch you, you will be held without bail. You will never see the inside of a server room again." "I need to prove the invoices are fake," I said. "You can't," Sarah countered. "They are perfect forgeries. Richard has been planning this for a long time. He needed a scapegoat for the missing funds, and you just volunteered." A sudden noise echoed through the garage, the screech of tires. "Go," Sarah hissed, shoving the envelope into my chest. "This has cash and a clean passport. Get out of the city, Robert. Go to Canada." "No," I said, backing away. "If I run, he wins." "If you stay, you die," she whispered intensely. I turned and ran toward the stairwell. I heard the heavy doors of a van sliding open behind me. Blackwood had found us. They must have had a tracker on Sarah's car that she didn't know about. I sprinted down the concrete stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I burst out onto the street level and dove into the crowd of commuters heading into the subway station. "Target is moving south, Blue Jacket," I heard a voice shout into a radio behind me. I vaulted over the turnstile, ignoring the angry shout of the station attendant. I ran down the escalator, pushing past tired office workers. I reached the platform just as a train was arriving. The screech of the brakes was deafening. I looked back. Two men in tactical gear were pushing through the crowd at the top of the stairs. They saw me. One of them reached under his jacket. I squeezed into the crowded train car. The doors hissed, trying to close, but a man with a briefcase was blocking the sensor. "Move!" I shouted, shoving him deeper into the car. The doors slid shut just as the Blackwood operatives reached the platform. I saw one of them slap the glass in frustration as the train lurched forward. I slumped against the metal pole, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was safe for the moment, but the net was tightening. They had me on the run. They had destroyed my name. They were framing me for $50 million in theft. I looked at the reflection of my hollow face in the dark subway window. Sarah was right. The logical move was to run, to take the passport and disappear. But I was not thinking logically anymore. I was thinking like an architect who sees a flaw in the design. Richard's frame-up relied on digital evidence. It relied on the fact that he controlled the narrative. But there was one thing he could not fake. One thing he could not digitize and manipulate. The physical reality, the ghost shipments, the weapons. I knew where the records were. Not the digital records, I had those, and he was spinning them as fake. I needed the hardware. The physical hard drives from the internal guidance systems of the ships themselves. The black box of the maritime world. These drives were not connected to the cloud. They were air-gapped. They recorded the exact weight, GPS coordinates, and radiation signatures of every container loaded onto the ships. If Richard was shipping weapons, the radiation sensors in the cargo holds would have logged the specific decay signatures of the uranium-depleted shells or the chemical propellants. That data was sitting in a hardened server vault on the 42nd floor of the Vanguard headquarters. I looked at my watch. It was 2 a.m. "Next stop, Financial District," the automated voice announced. I stood up. I wasn't going to Canada. I was going back to the belly of the beast. I got off the train 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way sticking to the alleys. The Vanguard Tower loomed above the city, a monolith of glass and steel. It looked impenetrable. But every building has a weakness. And usually, that weakness is vanity. When I designed the security system for the building, Richard had insisted on a private executive entrance in the underground parking structure, one that bypassed the main lobby security, so he could bring his mistresses in without being seen. He had demanded that this entrance not be logged on the main security grid. I had argued against it. He had overruled me. Now that arrogance was my key. I slipped into the parking garage through a ventilation shaft I had mapped out years ago during a fire safety audit. I dropped onto the concrete floor, dusting off the soot. The executive elevator was in the corner, guarded by a retina scanner. I did not have Richard's eyes, but I had the maintenance override code. I pried off the faceplate of the scanner and connected my smartwatch to the internal wiring. I ran a brute force decoding script. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of sweating, waiting for a patrol guard to walk by. Access granted. The elevator doors opened silently. I rode up to the 42nd floor. The hallway was dark. I moved like a shadow, avoiding the motion sensors I knew were placed at knee height. I reached the server vault. This was the hardest part. It required a physical key and a biometric handprint. I didn't have the key, but I had a heavy fire extinguisher I had grabbed from the hallway. I wrapped my jacket around the handle of the extinguisher to muffle the sound. I smashed it against the electronic lock mechanism. Once. Twice. The plastic casing shattered. Sparks flew. I jammed a screwdriver into the exposed solenoid and twisted. The lock disengaged with a dying click. I pushed the door open. The room was cold, filled with the hum of servers. I went straight to the rack labeled Maritime Operations, Offline Backup. I pulled out the master drive. It was a heavy, brick-like object. This was it. The undeniable truth. I connected it to a portable reader I had brought with me to verify the contents. I scrolled through the logs. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just small arms. Shipment 4022 destination, Sudan. Content medical supplies. Sensor reading class 4 radioactive material. Shipment 4058 destination, Syria. Content grain. Sensor reading high-grade sarin gas precursors. Richard wasn't just a smuggler. He was a war criminal. He was shipping chemical weapons components and dirty bomb materials under the guise of humanitarian aid. I felt a wave of nausea. This was why he was so desperate. This was why he had hired Blackwood. If this got out, he wouldn't just go to prison, he would be buried under the prison. I disconnected the drive and shoved it into my pocket. Freeze. The voice came from the doorway. I spun around. Standing there was the captain of the Blackwood team. He was huge, filling the door frame. He held a silenced pistol, leveled at my chest. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice flat, "your father pays very well to ensure you don't leave this building." I looked at him then, at the server rack behind me. "He is paying you with blood money," I said. "Do you know what is on this drive?" "I don't care," the mercenary said. "I am just the garbage man." He tightened his finger on the trigger. I had one card left to play. "Alexa," I shouted clearly. "Activate fire, suppression system sector 4. Authorization Omega 00. The mercenary frowned. "What?" The room exploded in noise. The halon gas system designed to extinguish electrical fires without water roared to life. Massive jets of pressurized gas blasted into the room. The gas was breathable for a few seconds, but the force of the blast knocked the mercenary backward. The sudden drop in temperature created a dense white fog, reducing visibility to 0 instantly. I dove to the floor, scrambling on my hands and knees. The gun went off phut-phut 2 bullets, sparking against the server racks above my head. I crawled through the white mist, moving by memory. I tackled the mercenary at the knees. He went down, swearing. I didn't stay to fight. I scrambled over him and out the door into the hallway. I sprinted toward the stairwell. The fire alarms were blaring now, waking up the entire building. I had the drive. I had the truth. And now I had to survive long enough to tell it. I was hiding in a Motel 6 near the airport, watching the planes take off, and wondering if I should be on one of them. The hard drive from the server room was burning a hole in my pocket, but raw data is only useful if you survive long enough to decrypt it. Richard had the police looking for a thief, and mercenaries looking for a corpse. I was walking a razor wire between the two. Then my burner phone buzzed. It was a text message. The number was blocked, but the content was unmistakable. "Meet me at Le Bernardin Private Room 2. 1 hour alone. I have the safe combo. You have the key to my money, Eleanor." My stepmother was a woman who viewed survival as a financial transaction. She had realized that Richard's ship was taking on water, and she was looking for a lifeboat. The virus I had unleashed, the one that exposed Richard's infidelity, had rattled her cage. But Eleanor could forgive infidelity if the price was right. What she could not forgive was poverty. I knew it was a trap. Of course it was a trap, but it was also an opportunity. Eleanor held the one piece of the puzzle I was missing. I had the shipping logs proving the illegal cargo, but I did not have the who. I needed the names of the politicians, the customs officers, and the judges Richard had bought over the last 30 years to keep his operations invisible. Those names were in the Black Ledger, a physical notebook Richard kept in a safe that didn't exist on any blueprint. I replied, "Coming." I drove to the city, ditching the car 3 blocks away. I entered the restaurant through the kitchen, slipping a $50 bill to a dishwasher I used to know. Le Bernardin was the kind of place where a salad cost $40 and the lighting was dim enough to hide a multitude of sins. Room 2 was at the back, soundproofed and secluded. I checked the hallway, no Blackwood goons. Just a nervous waiter holding a tray of crystal glasses. I opened the door. Eleanor was sitting at a small round table. She was wearing a black dress and a string of pearls, looking like a grieving widow before the body was even cold. Her face was pale, her makeup applied with a heavy hand to cover the dark circles under her eyes. "Robert," she said, her voice tight, "you look terrible. That jacket is an insult to fabric." "And you look desperate, Eleanor," I said, pulling out a chair. I did not sit. I stood, keeping the table between us. "Let us skip the pleasantries. You want your trust fund unlocked?" "I want the black ledger." She took a sip of wine, her hand shaking slightly. "You locked me out of everything, Robert. My cards, my accounts, even the gate to the driveway. I had to climb over the garden wall like a common thief to get here." "I merely put you on a budget," I said. "I will give you the combination to the wall safe in the library," she said, leaning forward. Her eyes were hard. "But first, I need you to say it. I need you to admit that you have the administrative access to restore my funds. I need you to promise me right now that, if I give you the code, you will transfer $5 million into my personal account immediately." I looked at her. I looked at the way she was angling her purse on the table, the clasp facing directly at me. It was a Chanel bag, quilted leather, and right next to the clasp, a tiny red light was covered by a piece of black tape. She was wearing a wire, or more likely, she had a high-fidelity recorder running in that bag. She wanted me to commit extortion on tape. If I said yes, "I control the money, give me the code and I will pay you," she would take that recording straight to the FBI. It would prove that I was hacking the system for financial gain, validating Richard's story that I was an embezzler. I reached into my pocket. I did not pull out a gun. I pulled out a small black box the size of a pack of cigarettes. It was a localized wide-spectrum frequency jammer. I had built it to block tracking signals, but it also did a wonderful job of scrambling microphones with electromagnetic interference. I flipped the switch. A tiny blue light blinked on. "You can turn off the recorder in your purse, Eleanor," I said calmly. "Or keep it on. All you will hear on the playback is static that sounds like a jet engine." Eleanor's face crumbled. She snatched her purse off the table, clutching it to her chest. "You bastard!" "You are not good at this," I said, sitting down finally. "Richard sent you, didn't he? He told you that if you got me to confess on tape, he would forgive you for destroying the dining room. He promised you that everything would go back to normal." "He is my husband," Eleanor hissed. "He loves me." "He loves possession," I corrected. "And right now he is looking to liquidate his assets." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila folder. It was not the Black Ledger. It was the Monaco exit strategy file I had compiled from the data I scraped during the virus attack. I slid it across the table. "Read it," I commanded. Eleanor hesitated, then opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first document. It was a draft of a divorce settlement, dated 3 weeks ago. "This is a draft," she stammered. "People write drafts when they are angry." "Look at the date," I said. "He wrote this before the party, before I walked out. And look at page 4, the asset division." Eleanor turned the page. Her breath hitched. "0, she whispered. "He has moved the assets to a shell company in the Cayman Islands," I explained. "The company is listed under the name of Inez Valienta. That is the 22-year-old model he has been seeing." The plan was simple, Eleanor. He was going to provoke a fight, blame the divorce on your instability, and cut you loose. By next Monday, you would have been homeless. The only reason he hasn't done it yet is because I froze the accounts before he could make the final transfer. Eleanor stared at the paper. The reality of it washed over her. She had been fighting to protect a man who had already sold her. She wasn't his partner. She was just another piece of depreciating inventory. "He promised me," she said, her voice breaking. Tears, real tears this time, spilled onto the expensive tablecloth. "He said we were building a dynasty." "He was building an escape pod," I said brutally. "1 seat. No passengers. Eleanor looked up at me. The hatred in her eyes shifted. It was no longer directed at me. It was a cold, terrifying clarity directed at the man who had betrayed her. "The safe is not in the library," she said softly. I leaned in. "Where is it?" "It is in the wine cellar," she said. "Behind the rack of 1982 Bordeaux. You have to pull the third bottle from the left to trigger the mechanism. It is biometric, but there is a keypad backup." "And the code?" I asked. 090899, she recited. I paused. "September 8th, 1999. "That is the day he met Inez," Eleanor said, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "I saw it on her passport when we flew private last year. He used the day he met his mistress as the code to his secrets." "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, standing up. "Burn him, Robert," she said. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for the trust fund. She looked at me with the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Burn it all down. While Eleanor and I were having our moment of truth, the other Sterling was busy proving just how incompetent he really was. Across town at the Vanguard headquarters, Julian was sitting in the CEO's chair. It was too big for him. He was sweating through his shirt. The office was in chaos. The phone on his desk was flashing with 12 different lines on hold. The V-Track system was still down. The trucks were still idling. The drivers were rioting. But the biggest problem was the Red Star shipment. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sterling," his secretary said, her voice shrill. "I have the Port Authority on line 1. They are asking about container number 7742. They say the paperwork is missing the hazardous materials clearance." Julian rubbed his temples. He had a headache that felt like a drill bit. He didn't know what container 7742 was. He didn't know what was in it. All he knew was that Richard had called him 10 minutes ago screaming that the shipment had to move today, or they would lose a very important client. Just tell them it is approved," Julian shouted at the intercom. "Sir, I can't just tell them," the secretary argued. "I need an override code. The system won't generate a manifest without a license number." "Robert deleted the licenses," Julian yelled, slamming his fist on the desk. "We don't have the damn numbers." "Then we should hold the shipment, sir," the secretary suggested, sensibly. "No," Julian panicked. He remembered his father's threat. "If that ship doesn't sail, Julian, don't bother coming home." "Overwrite it manually. Use the CEO emergency authorization." "I am authorizing it right now. Send the container." "Okay, sir," the secretary said, sounding doubtful. Authorization logged. Julian slumped back in his chair. He thought he had solved a problem. He thought he was being a leader. He was wrong. Container 7742 was not carrying auto parts. It was carrying 5 tons of acetic anhydride. It is a dual-use chemical. It is used to make film and aspirin. It is also the primary ingredient used to refine heroin. And it requires a special DEA license to export. A license Vanguard did not have. 40 minutes later, the container was lifted onto a ship at the port of Chicago. But it didn't get far. When I had wiped the system, I hadn't just deleted the licenses. I had flagged specific container IDs in the database of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. I had set a digital tripwire. As soon as Julian's override code hit the network, a red alert flashed on the screen of a customs officer 3 miles away. I was driving away from the restaurant when I heard the news on the radio. "Breaking news," the announcer said. "Federal agents have raided the Port of Chicago. A massive seizure of illegal chemicals has been reported on a vessel operated by Vanguard Global Logistics. Sources say the shipment was authorized personally by the acting CEO Julian Sterling." I gripped the steering wheel. Julian had walked right into the wood chipper. The raid was aggressive. I saw the footage later. Agents and windbreakers swarming the docks. They cracked open the container right there on the pier. Barrels of chemicals stamped with false labels. The fine for shipping undeclared acetic anhydride is $25,000 per violation. There were 200 barrels. That was $5 million right there. But the money wasn't the problem. The problem was the criminal liability. By signing that override, Julian had attached his name to a federal felony. He wasn't just an incompetent heir anymore. He was a drug trafficker in the eyes of the law. I parked my car in a dark alley, behind a defunct Blockbuster video store. I checked my watch. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I had the hard drive with the shipping data. I had the location of the black ledger. Eleanor was neutralized. Julian was about to be arrested. But Richard was still standing. And a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. He would know that Eleanor had flipped. He would know that Julian was finished. He would have nothing left to protect and no one left to trust. He would be waiting for me. I pulled the collar of my jacket up against the wind. The final pieces were falling into place. I didn't need to hack the system anymore. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do, crush anyone who tried to cheat it. I took a deep breath of the freezing air. It tasted like snow and gasoline. "Check," I whispered. The game was almost over. Now, I just had to survive the checkmate. The morning sun rose over Chicago, but for Vanguard Global Logistics, it was the beginning of the long night. I sat in the corner office of Sarah Jenkins's law firm on the 35th floor of a steel skyscraper. The view was panoramic, offering a clear sightline of the financial district where the bloodletting was about to begin. On the large mahogany conference table, 3 monitors were set up. One tracked the stock market, one tracked social media trends, and one was tuned to the 24-hour news cycle. At 9:30 in the morning, the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange rang. Vanguard Global Logistics ticker, symbol VGL, opened at $84 a share. By 9:31, it was trading at $60. By 9:45, it had free-fallen to $42. The news of the federal raid on the port had broken overnight. The image of DEA agents rolling barrels of acetic anhydride out of a Vanguard container was plastered on every financial website in the world. The caption was devastating Vanguard executive links to drug trade. I took a sip of black coffee. It was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. "It is a bloodbath," Sarah said, walking into the room. She dropped a stack of papers on the table. "The SEC has just announced a formal investigation. They are suspending trading on VGL at noon pending an inquiry. That gives us 2 hours to make sure it never recovers," I said. I turned my attention to the internal audio feed I had compromised from the Vanguard boardroom. Richard had called an emergency meeting with the top shareholders. I put the call on speaker. "It is a setup." Richard's voice was cracking, stripped of its usual baritone confidence. "Robert Johnson planted those chemicals. He falsified the manifest before he left. This is an act of corporate terrorism by a disgruntled former employee." "Richard," a cold voice cut in. It was Hamilton, the representative for the majority pension fund investors. "You are the chairman. Your son Julian authorized the shipment yesterday. We have the digital signature. Are you telling us that your son is conspiring with the man you claim is insane?" "Julian was tricked," Richard screamed. "He is young. He is inexperienced. Robert manipulated the system." "The system," Hamilton replied, his voice dripping with ice. "That is the other problem. We are hearing reports that your entire logistics network is still offline. Ships are sitting in the harbor. Trucks are not moving. You are losing $10 million an hour in operational downtime. When will the system be back up?" "We are working on it," Richard lied. "We have a team of experts." "You have nothing," I whispered to the empty room. I turned to my laptop. It was time to drop the second bomb. The raid was bad, but it was survivable. Companies survived scandals. They paid fines, they fired scapegoats, and they moved on. But companies do not survive when they lose the legal right to exist. I opened my Twitter account. I had 0 followers. That did not matter. I tagged the official accounts of Amazon, FedEx, DHL, and the Wall Street Journal. I uploaded a single PDF document, the RJ Solutions Intellectual Property Assignment. Along with it, I posted a short caption. Vanguard Global Logistics is currently operating its entire global supply chain on pirated software. The license for VTrack was revoked 48 hours ago. Any continued use of this system is a federal crime and a violation of international copyright law. I am the owner, and I am suing. I hit post. The internet is a terrifying organism. It took 4 minutes for the algorithm to pick it up. It took 10 minutes for the legal bots to flag it. And it took 20 minutes for the phone in the boardroom to ring. I listened as Richard picked up the speakerphone. This is Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling, this is the General Counsel for Amazon, a woman's voice said. She sounded like she was reading a death sentence. We have just been made aware of a copyright dispute regarding your logistics architecture. Our compliance algorithms cannot interface with unlicensed software. It is a liability risk we cannot accept. It is a lie, Richard sputtered. My brother wrote that code. It belongs to the family. The patent registration says otherwise, the lawyer replied. Effective immediately, Amazon is suspending all third-party shipping contracts with Vanguard until this matter is resolved. Good day. The line went dead. Then it rang again. It was FedEx, then Walmart, then Target. It was a domino effect of catastrophic proportions. In the span of 30 minutes, Vanguard lost 60% of its revenue stream. The shareholders in the room were not shouting anymore. They were silent. It was the silence of people watching their net worth evaporate. Gentlemen, Hamilton said quietly, I move for a vote of no confidence in the chairman. I muted the audio. I did not need to hear the rest. Richard was finished as a businessman, but his day was about to get much more personal. I switched the monitor to the security cameras at Sterling Manor. Richard had fled the office, leaving his lawyers to deal with the sharks. He had retreated to his fortress, thinking he would be safe behind his gates. He was wrong. A black SUV with no license plates had just rammed through the wrought iron gates of the estate. It did not stop. It tore across the pristine lawn, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the frozen grass, and screeched to a halt in front of the main entrance. 4 men stepped out. They were not wearing suits. They were wearing leather jackets and tracksuits. They were the investors. From the Eastern Bloc, the men whose perishable goods were currently rotting in a locked warehouse because of the system failure. They did not ring the doorbell. One of them, a giant of a man carrying a baseball bat, smashed the glass of the front door. I watched as Richard appeared in the foyer, looking small and terrified. He was holding a phone, trying to call the police. The giant slapped the phone out of his hand. I could not hear the dialogue, but the body language was universal. The giant grabbed Richard by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him against the wall. He pointed the bat at Richard's face, then at the house, then at the burning fireplace. They were giving him an ultimatum. Fix the system or we burn this house down with you in it. Richard was weeping. He was shaking his head, trying to explain that he couldn't fix it, that he didn't have the codes. The mobsters didn't care about technical difficulties. They cared about lost profit. The giant released Richard, letting him slide to the floor. He swung the bat and smashed a Ming-Va standing on a pedestal. It was a warning shot. They turned and walked out, leaving Richard sobbing in the wreckage of his foyer. While Richard was facing the consequences of his shadow dealings, Julian was facing the consequences of his own stupidity. My half-brother had watched the stock ticker too. He had seen his inheritance vanish in real time. He had seen the news reports calling him a drug trafficker. And Julian, being Julian, decided that the best way to handle the pressure was to numb it. I pulled up the traffic camera feed for Lakeshore Drive. A bright yellow Ferrari was weaving through traffic at 100 miles an hour. It was Julian. He was fleeing the city, heading north, perhaps thinking he could outrun the FBI warrants that were undoubtedly being typed up at that very moment. He was not driving well. The car swerved violently, clipping the median strip. Sparks flew. I picked up my phone. I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It was the direct line to the crisis management team, a shady outfit of ex-cops and lawyers on Richard's payroll, whose sole job was to make Julian's DUIs and assaults disappear. "Crisis desk," a gruff voice answered. "This is Robert Johnson," I said. "Verify voice ID, Alpha Charlie 9. There was a pause. Voice verified. "What can we do for you, Mr. Johnson?" They didn't know I was out. They didn't watch the news. They just followed orders. "We have a situation with Julian Sterling," I said. "He is currently driving northbound on Lakeshore Drive. He is erratic. I want you to stand down." "Stand down?" the voice asked, confused. "Sir, we usually intercept the police comms and send an extraction team to swap the driver before the cops arrive." "Not today," I said coldly. "Today you do not answer his call. You do not send a team. You let him drive. Is that clear?" "Understood," the voice said. "Ticket closed." I hung up. On the screen, the yellow Ferrari lost control. Julian tried to overtake a semi-truck on the shoulder. The sports car spun out, hitting a patch of black ice. It pirouetted across 3 lanes of traffic and slammed nose first into the concrete barrier. The hood crumpled like tinfoil. Steam and smoke billowed out. It wasn't a fatal crash. The airbags deployed instantly, cushioning the blow. But the car was totaled. Traffic stopped. People got out of their cars, holding up their phones to record. Julian stumbled out of the wreckage. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but mostly he looked intoxicated. He was stumbling, waving his arms, screaming at the other drivers. "Do you know who I am?" he shrieked, his voice faint through the traffic cam microphone. "My father owns this city. I will buy your whole family." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed the crisis team. I watched him put the phone to his ear. I imagined the ringback tone, once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He dialed again. His face contorted in confusion and panic. This had never happened before. Whenever he messed up, the cleaners were there within 5 minutes. Why weren't they answering? Sirens wailed in the distance. Blue and red lights reflected off the snow. 2 police cruisers pulled up. Officers stepped out, guns drawn. They weren't taking chances with a man who had just crashed a supercar and was screaming like a lunatic. "Get on the ground!" the officer shouted. Julian didn't get on the ground. He threw his phone at the cop. "Call my lawyer, call my dad." The officer tackled him. It was brutal and efficient. Julian went face down into the slush. His hands were wrenched behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut. A news helicopter hovered overhead, capturing the shot that would grace the front page of every paper in America tomorrow. The end of an era. The image was poetic. Julian Sterling, the golden boy, face pressed against the dirty asphalt, surrounded by the wreckage of a $250,000 toy, being read his Miranda rights. I leaned back in my chair in the high-rise office. The silence in the room was heavy. Sarah was standing by the window, looking down at the street. "You did it," she said softly. "You actually did it. Richard is ruined. Julian is in jail. The company is dead." "Not dead," I corrected her. "Just rebooting." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked at the reflection of my face in the glass. The shaved head, the tired eyes. I looked different. I felt different. "The board will try to liquidate," I said. "They will sell off the assets to pay the fines. The ships, the warehouses, the trucks. It will be a fire sale." "And who is going to buy a toxic asset like Vanguard?" Sarah asked. I turned to look at her. "No one wants Vanguard, but everyone wants V-Track, and I own the license." "So, what is the plan?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms. "You have destroyed them. Are you just going to walk away?" No, I said. I am going to make them an offer they cannot refuse. But first, I have one more loose end to tie up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the hard drive I had stolen from the server room, the one with the radiation logs, the one that proved Richard wasn't just a bad father, but a monster. I need you to take this to the U.S. attorney, I said, handing her the drive. Don't give it to the police, give it to the feds. I want this to be a RICO case. I want them to charge him with racketeering arms, trafficking, and treason. Sarah took the drive. She weighed it in her hand. This will put him away for the rest of his life, Robert. He is your father. He said I wouldn't last a week, I said, looking back at the skyline where the Vanguard logo sat atop the tallest tower, dark and lifeless. It has been 6 days, and I am the only one left standing. The empire had fallen. The knights were captured. The king was cornered. Now it was time to clear the board and start a new game. The interrogation room at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Chicago was exactly as I had expected. It was a windowless cube painted in a shade of gray, designed to induce despair. The air was stale, recycled through vents that hummed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. There was a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and a two-way mirror that everyone knew was there, but pretended to ignore. I sat on one side of the table. Sarah Jenkins sat next to me. Across from us sat Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Diaz. Miller looked like he had not slept in a week, and Diaz looked like she wanted to arrest someone just to meet her monthly quota. You are in a lot of trouble, Mr. Johnson, Agent Miller said, sliding a tablet across the table. We received this digital file anonymously at 4 a.m. today. It is very compelling. I looked down at the screen. Sarah leaned in her shoulder, brushing mine. The video played. It was grainy shot from a distance, mimicking the style of surveillance footage. The timestamp in the corner read October 14th, 2024. The location appeared to be the underground parking structure of a rival logistics firm. In the video, a man who looked exactly like me was standing by the trunk of a sedan. He was wearing my signature trench coat. He was talking to a known operative from a Chinese shipping conglomerate. The operative handed the man me a thick briefcase. The man opened it, revealing stacks of cash, nodded, and shook hands. It was a deepfake. A very expensive, very high-quality deepfake. Richard had not just hired hackers. He had hired a visual effects studio. He was trying to prove that I had been selling Vanguard's secrets for years, justifying his claim that I was a corporate spy and an embezzler. That is $50,000 in that briefcase, Agent Diaz said, pointing at the screen. And that is you taking it. We have matched the facial geometry. It is a 99% match. It looks like me, I admitted calmly. It walks like me. It even wears my coat. So you confess? Miller asked, reaching for his handcuffs. I confess that my father has excellent taste in fiction, I said. Sarah placed a hand on my arm to silence me, then turned to the agents. My client denies the authenticity of this footage. We are prepared to offer forensic proof that this video is a digital fabrication created within the last 48 hours. Miller scoffed. This isn't a cartoon, Ms. Jenkins. We had our tech guys run it. No splices, no edits. Your tech guys are looking for video editing, I said, leaning forward. They are not looking for algorithmic generation. May I? I reached for the tablet. Miller hesitated, then nodded. I paused the video at the 12-second mark. Look at the shadows, I said. The timestamp says this was filmed at 2 p.m. in October. The light source in this garage comes from the overhead fluorescent tubes and the natural light spilling in from the south ramp. Based on the angle of the sun in Chicago on that specific date, the shadow of the pillar behind me should be cast at a 30-degree angle to the left. In this video, the shadow is at a 45-degree angle. The agents squinted at the screen. Furthermore, I continued my voice, steady and professorial. Look at the blinking pattern of the eyes. A human being blinks spontaneously every 4 to 6 seconds. The Robert in this video blinks on a perfect 3-second loop. It is a rendering artifact. The AI that generated this used a looped sample of my face. Shadows and blinking, Miller said, unimpressed. That is your defense physics. No, I said. That is just the observation. My defense is the metadata. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was a printout of the file analysis I had run on a copy of the video I had intercepted before I even walked into the building. Every video file created by a camera has a unique digital fingerprint, I explained. It records the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. But a deepfake does not come from a camera. It comes from a render engine. If you run a hex code analysis on the file, you will find a residual signature from a software called Face Swap Pro Enterprise. And if you trace the IP address of the uploader, as I have done here on line 10, you will see it did not come from an anonymous whistleblower. I tapped the paper. It was uploaded from a static IP address registered to the guest Wi-Fi network at the Sterling Manor, specifically the router located in the West Wing study. Agent Diaz picked up the paper. She scanned the lines of code I had printed out. Her expression shifted from skepticism to alarm. He created the evidence in his own house, I said. He was in such a rush to frame me that he forgot to use a VPN. The room went silent. The air conditioner hummed. If this is true, Miller said slowly, then Richard Sterling just filed a false federal report. That is a felony. Richard Sterling has committed a lot of felonies, I said. Filing a false report is the least of your worries. I reached into my inner pocket again. The agents flinched. I moved slowly, showing them my empty hands before pulling out a small USB drive. It wasn't the master drive I had stolen from the server room. I was not ready to give them everything yet. This was a teaser. It contained anonymized shipping manifests and the routed paths of 3 specific containers that had bypassed customs inspection in 2023. What is this? Diaz asked. This, I said, sliding the drive across the metal table, is probable cause. You want to know why my father is trying to frame me. It is because I found out what he was really moving through those ports. I am not a spy agent. I am the man who refused to look the other way. What is on the drive? Miller asked, picking it up as if it were radioactive. Proof that Vanguard Global Logistics has been transporting dual-use technology to sanctioned nations. I lied partially. It was not dual-use, it was straight-up weapons, but dual-use sounded more bureaucratic and less like a spy novel, which made it more believable to the FBI. I have scrubbed the names to protect my sources for now. But if you send a team to the Vanguard headquarters right now, specifically to the physical archives on the 42nd floor, you will find the hard copies that match this digital data. Miller looked at Diaz. Get the warrant, he said, and get a tactical team. If they are moving sanctioned tech, this just became a national security issue. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table. We had turned the tide. We hadn't just defended. We had weaponized their own investigation against them. While I was sitting in the sterile safety of the FBI office, Richard Sterling was about to experience the heat of the fire he had started. 40 minutes later, the scene at the Vanguard Tower was chaotic. I could not see it, but I knew the layout of the building better than I knew the back of my hand. I knew that when the FBI black SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb, the lobby security guards, most of them low-wage contractors, would step aside immediately. They weren't going to take a bullet for minimum wage. Richard was in his office on the top floor. He was pacing, waiting for the call from Agent Miller saying that I was in handcuffs. Instead, his secretary burst into the room. "Mr. Sterling," she screamed. "The FBI, they are in the lobby. They have a search warrant for the archives." Richard froze. His face, usually flushed with whiskey, and arrogance drained of color. He knew what was in the archives. The digital wipes I had done were effective, but Richard, being a paranoid man of the old school, had kept paper backups of the Black Ledger transactions and the shipping manifests in the fireproof vault in the archive room. He thought the paper made him safe because it couldn't be hacked. He forgot that paper has a much older weakness. "Stall them!" Richard roared at his secretary. "Lock the elevators!" He ran out of his office and down the private staircase to the 42nd floor. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He had to destroy the paper. He had to burn it all. He burst into the archive room. It was a large windowless space filled with rows of metal shelving. In the center was a metal shredding bin, but shredding would take too long. He grabbed a metal wastebasket and dragged it to the center of the room. He began pulling files off the shelves, the files labeled Special Projects, and throwing them into the bin. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped half of them on the floor. "Burn," he muttered, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the documents. "Just burn." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his gold Zippo lighter. He flicked it open. The flame danced yellow and eager. He threw the lighter into the basket. The dry paper caught instantly. Whoosh! The fire leaped up, hungry and bright. Richard grabbed more files, throwing them onto the pyre. The smoke began to fill the room, black and acrid. "Die!" he screamed at the paper. "Disappear!" The heat triggered the ceiling sensors. Normally, a building of this sophistication would use a halon gas system for a server room or an archive to prevent water damage to the documents. Richard knew this. He was counting on the gas to extinguish the fire eventually, but by then, the paper would be ash. The gas wouldn't ruin the evidence. The fire would. But Richard had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the system architect, and 3 days before I left, during a routine maintenance check, I had updated the fire suppression protocols for the archive room. I had switched the suppression agent from gas to water. And not just a sprinkler mist. I had programmed the deluge protocol. As the temperature in the room hit 150 degrees, the alarm didn't just beep. It shrieked. And then the ceiling opened up. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a high-pressure torrent. 4 nozzles aimed directly at the center of the room, right where the heat signature was strongest, blasted water at 60 gallons per minute. The force of the water hit Richard like a physical punch. It knocked him backward into the metal shelving. The fire in the wastebasket didn't stand a chance. It was drowned in 2 seconds. But the water didn't stop. It soaked everything. It turned the unburned documents into a soggy, heavy pulp, but it did not destroy the ink. In fact, the water welded the pages together into a solid, wet brick of evidence. Richard lay on the floor, gasping for air, water pouring over his expensive suit, ruining his Italian shoes, plastering his silver hair to his skull. He was shivering not from cold, but from shock. The door to the archive room was kicked open. "Federal agents," a voice boomed. "Hands where I can see them." Richard looked up through the curtain of water. 3 agents in tactical gear stood there, weapons drawn. They saw a soaking wet billionaire lying amidst a pile of half-burnt soggy evidence, looking guilty as sin. They didn't need a confession. The scene was the confession. Back at the FBI, Office Agent Miller received a call on his cell phone. He listened for a moment, his eyes fixed on me. "Understood," Miller said. "Secure the scene, bag everything, even the wet stuff." He hung up. He looked at me with a new expression. It wasn't friendly, but it was respectful. It was the look a chess player gives an opponent who just checkmated him in 4 moves. "We have secured the Vanguard archives," Miller said. "Your father was found attempting to destroy evidence. We have him in custody." "And the video?" I asked. "The lab just confirmed your theory," Diaz said, looking at her laptop. "The shadows are wrong. It is a fake. You are free to go, Mr. Johnson, for now, but do not leave the city. I have nowhere else to go, I said, standing up. This city is my home. I walked out of the interrogation room, Sarah by my side. We walked through the busy bullpen of the FBI office, past agents who were scrambling to organize the massive raid on Vanguard. We stepped out into the crisp Chicago afternoon. The sun was shining, reflecting off the snow. It was blindingly bright. He tried to burn it, Sarah said, checking her phone for updates. Sources say the sprinklers went off. He was caught holding the lighter. I knew he would, I said. He is a man of dramatic gestures. He doesn't understand that you can't burn the truth when the architect controls the rain. I pulled out my phone. I had one last message to send. I opened the contact labeled Dad. I knew he wouldn't read it immediately. He was probably being processed, stripped of his wet clothes, and put into an orange jumpsuit. But he would see it eventually. When his high-priced lawyers finally got him his phone back, this message would be waiting for him like a tombstone. I typed, "You said I wouldn't last a week. Today is day 6. How is the water?" I hit send. I watched the delivered status appear. It was the most satisfying pixel I had ever seen. What now? Sarah asked, wrapping her coat tighter against the wind. Now, I said, hailing a cab. We go to the office, the real office. Vanguard is a crime scene, she said. Not Vanguard, I said. I am talking about the building across the street, the one with the view of the burning castle. The false evidence had been washed away. The real evidence was now in federal custody. The king was in chains. But the game wasn't over. A king can rule from a prison cell if he still has his gold. My next move wasn't about freedom. It was about poverty. I had to ensure that when Richard Sterling finally made bail, he wouldn't have 2 nickels to rub together. I had 6 days of victory. I needed 1 more day to make it permanent. The phone rang at 6 in the evening. It was a burner number, but I knew the voice instantly. It was the voice of a man who had spent the last 24 hours in a federal holding cell before posting a $10 million bond. It was a voice that had been stripped of its polish, leaving only the raw, jagged gravel of desperation. "Robert," Richard Sterling said. "Richard," I replied, sitting in the dark of Sarah's conference room. "I thought they took your phone away." "I am out," he said. "For now. Money still buys freedom in this country, son. You should know that." "I am not your son," I said. "Come to the tower," he commanded. "The office. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Just you. We need to end this. I am ready to sign the papers. You want the company, it is yours. Just stop the bleeding. Stop the lawsuits. Stop the feds." "It is a trap," I said simply. "It is a surrender," he countered. His voice broke just for a fraction of a second. "I am tired, Robert. Julian is in jail. Eleanor is hysterical. I just want to retire. Come up. I will sign the deed of transfer and you can unlock the system." We walk away. Deal. I looked at the receiver. I knew with mathematical certainty that he was lying. Richard Sterling did not surrender. He negotiated until he could find a way to stab you in the back. But I also knew that this was the endgame. He was cornered. If I did not go, he would burn whatever was left of the assets, just to spite me. And part of me, the part that had spent 38 years seeking his approval, needed to look him in the eye one last time. "I will be there," I said. "But if I smell even a whiff of a setup, I release the rest of the data. And that data does not just put you in prison, Richard. It puts you on a government kill list." 8 o'clock, he said and hung up. I spent the next hour preparing. I did not pack a briefcase. I packed for a war zone. I put on a Kevlar vest, strapping it tight against my chest. It was bulky, so I wore a heavy wool coat over it. I taped a small, high-fidelity microphone to the inside of my collar. I connected it via Bluetooth to my phone, which was running a specialized app I had written. It was a dead man's stream. It broadcasted audio in real time to a secure cloud server. If the stream was interrupted abruptly, or if my heart rate monitor flatlined, the server would automatically email the audio file to the FBI, the New York Times, and Sarah Jenkins. "You do not have to do this," Sarah said, watching me check the connection. "We have won. He is indicted. Let the law finish him." "The law is too slow," I said, holstering a taser, not a gun. Never a gun under my arm. "And he thinks he can still talk his way out of this. I need to show him that the conversation is over." I arrived at the Vanguard Tower at 7:55. The lobby was dark. The federal crime scene tape had been ripped across the elevators, but someone had cut through it. The security guard was gone. The building felt like a tomb. I took the private elevator to the top floor. The silence was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. When the doors opened, the lights in the executive suite were dim. I walked down the long hallway toward the double doors of the CEO's office. I pushed them open. Richard was sitting behind his massive oak desk. He looked like a ghost. His skin was gray, his eyes sunken. He was wearing a fresh suit, but it hung loosely on his frame. He was not alone. Standing in the corners of the room were two men I recognized. They were not the usual Blackwood operatives. These men were older, harder. They were personal retainers, men who had been on Richard's payroll since the days he was breaking kneecaps on the docks. And sitting on the leather sofa to the right was Eleanor. She looked terrified. Her mascara was running, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Close the door, Robert," Richard said. I stepped inside and let the door click shut behind me. "I see you brought an audience." And some muscle. "Security," Richard said, waving a hand dismissively. "These are dangerous times." "You said you had papers for me to sign," I said, staying near the door. I kept my hands visible. "Let us see them." "Sit down," Richard commanded. "I prefer to stand," Richard sighed. He opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk. It was blank. "There are no papers, are there?" I asked. "There is a choice," Richard said. He stood up slowly. "You think you have won, Robert. You think because you seized the ships and froze the accounts you have defeated me. But you forget something. I built this empire from nothing. I built it with blood. You are just code. You are soft." "I am the one standing here," I said. "You are the one facing 20 years for racketeering." "Only if the evidence holds up," Richard said. "And only if the witness testifies." He reached under his desk. I tensed my hand, moving toward the taser. But he did not pull out a weapon immediately. He pulled out a remote control. He pressed a button. The heavy steel shutters on the windows slammed down, sealing the room off from the city lights. We were now in a steel box. "Here is the deal," Richard said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are going to sit at that computer terminal over there. You are going to enter the administrator codes. You are going to unlock VTrack. You are going to issue a global update that wipes the logs of the last 5 years. You are going to clean my slate." "And if I refuse?" I asked. Richard reached into his jacket then. He pulled out a gun. It was a matte black pistol, ugly and efficient. He pointed it directly at my chest. Eleanor gasped, putting her hands over her mouth. "Richard, you said we were just going to talk to him." "Shut up, Eleanor." Richard snapped, not looking at her. His eyes were locked on me. "He is not your son. He has cancer. He has been poisoning this family for years." "I am the only reason this family has a dime," I said, keeping my voice level. "I built the system that bought that gun, Richard." "You were a tool," Richard shouted, his composure cracking. "That is all you ever were, a calculator that breathed. I took you in when your mother died. I fed you, I educated you. Not because I loved you, but because I saw you were good at math. You were an investment, Robert. An asset, and now you are a liability." The words should have hurt. A week ago they would have destroyed me. But tonight, they just felt like confirmation. He was admitting what I had known in my marrow for decades. "So that is the plan?" I asked. "You shoot me. How do you explain a dead body in your office while you are out on bail?" "Suicide," Richard said with a cold smile. "The stress of the investigation was too much for you. You came here to beg for forgiveness. When I refused, you unlocked the system to try and buy my love. And then, in a fit of despair, you turned the gun on yourself. My men here will testify to it. Eleanor will testify to it." He turned the gun slightly toward Eleanor. "Won't you, my dear?" Eleanor sobbed. "Richard, please. This is murder. I can't." "You will," Richard roared. "Or do you want to end up on the street? Do you want to be poor Eleanor because that is the alternative? If he does not unlock that system, we lose everything. We go to prison. Do you want to die in a cell?" Eleanor shrank back terrified. She looked at me, then at Richard. She was trapped between her greed and her conscience. "Sit at the terminal," Richard commanded, pointing the gun back at me. "Now, unlock it." I looked at the gun. I looked at the computer. I started to laugh. It started as a chuckle and grew into a loud, echoing laugh that filled the sealed room. "What is so funny?" Richard demanded, his hand shaking. "I will kill you. I swear to God, "You can't kill me," I said, stepping forward. "Because if you kill me, you stay locked out forever. You need the key." "Exactly," Richard said. "So type it in." "That is the funny part, Dad," I said, using the word like an insult. "There is no key." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You think I locked the system," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You think I encrypted it and held it for ransom. Because that is what you would do. You are a hoarder. You keep things, you leverage things." I took another step. The bodyguards tensed, but Richard waved them off. He wanted to hear this. "But I am an architect," I continued. "And sometimes when a building is rotten to the foundation, you do not renovate it. You demolish it." "Unlock it," Richard screamed. "I didn't lock it, Richard," I said softly. "I deleted it." The silence in the room was absolute. "I ran a 7-pass wipe on the servers," I explained, savoring every syllable. "Every line of code, every customer database, every shipping manifest, every historical record. It is gone. It is all zeros. There is nothing to unlock. Even if I wanted to help you, I couldn't. Vanguard is not a company anymore. It is just a word on a building." Richard stared at me. His brain was trying to process the magnitude of the loss. He wasn't just broke. He was erased. The leverage, the history, the legacy, it was dust. "You lie," he whispered. "Go ahead." I pointed to the computer. "Log in. Check the root directory. It is empty." Richard's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The realization hit him that he had no bargaining chip. He had no future. "Then you are useless," he snarled. He raised the gun. He wasn't aiming to threaten anymore. He was aiming to kill. "Richard, no!" Eleanor screamed. It happened in slow motion. Richard's finger tightened on the trigger. I braced myself, trusting the Kevlar, preparing to charge. But Eleanor moved first. Driven by the sheer terror of being an accessory to capital murder, she grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the side table and threw it. She didn't aim at Richard. She wasn't that brave. She threw it at the bodyguard closest to her. The glass shattered against the man's head. He yelled in surprise. The distraction was enough. Richard flinched his eyes, darting to the side for a fraction of a second. I lunged. I didn't go for the gun. I was too far away. I went for the light switch. I slammed my fist into the panel. The room plunged into total darkness. Bang. The gun went off. I felt the impact a hammer blow to my ribs. The bullet hit the Kevlar plate. It knocked the wind out of me, but it didn't penetrate. "Get him!" Richard screamed in the dark. "Kill him!" I rolled across the floor. I knew this office. I had designed the layout. I knew exactly where the furniture was. I scrambled behind the heavy oak desk. "Turn on the lights," one of the bodyguards shouted. I heard footsteps rushing toward the switch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the taser. I rolled out from behind the desk just as the lights flickered back on. The bodyguard was standing by the door. I fired. The prongs hit him in the chest. He convulsed and dropped like a sack of cement. Richard spun around, aiming the gun at me again. "It is over, Richard!" I shouted. "The police are on their way. Sarah called them 5 minutes ago. They heard everything." "I don't care!" Richard yelled. He looked insane now. "If I go down, you come with me." He raised the gun to my head. Suddenly, the steel shutters on the windows exploded inward. Crash flashbang grenades rolled into the room. Bang flash! A blinding white light seared my retinas. A deafening boom shattered the air. I curled into a ball, covering my ears. "Police, drop the weapon. Drop it now." The SWAT team swarmed through the main doors, which they had breached with a battering ram. Through the ringing in my ears and the spots in my vision, I saw Richard. He was still standing, blinking blindly, waving the gun. "Drop it," the officer screamed. Richard hesitated. For a second I thought he would force them to shoot him. It would have been the easy way out. But Richard Sterling was a coward at heart. He dropped the gun. It clattered on the floor. He fell to his knees, putting his hands on his head. Eleanor was screaming in the corner, curled up in a fetal position. An officer grabbed me, hauling me up. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine," I wheezed, rubbing my bruised ribs. "I am the victim." I looked at Richard as they cuffed him. He looked up at me. His eyes were empty. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. There was only a vast, hollow confusion. "You deleted it," he whispered. "Really?" "I told you," I said, my voice rough but clear. "I am not a screw. You can replace Richard. I am the engine, and the engine just quit." The police dragged him out. I stood in the wreckage of the office. The smell of cordite and fear hung in the air. My chest ached where the bullet had hit the vest. I walked over to the computer terminal. I typed in a simple command just to verify. dir/root. The screen blinked back, "File not found." I smiled. "Goodbye, Vanguard," I said. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the empty shell of the empire behind me. The week was over, and I was still alive. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois is a building designed to intimidate. It is a fortress of marble and mahogany, a place where the air is always cool and smells of floor wax and fear. On this particular Tuesday morning, the gallery was packed. Reporters from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every major television network were squeezed onto the wooden benches. They were there to witness the final act of the Sterling tragedy. This was being called the trial of the century by the pundits. But for me, it was just a funeral service for a lie that had lived too long. Technically, there were two cases being heard concurrently due to the overlapping evidence. The first was RJ Solutions versus Vanguard Global Logistics, a civil suit regarding intellectual property theft and copyright infringement. The second and far more serious case was the United States of America versus Richard Sterling regarding charges of racketeering arms, trafficking, and wire fraud. The irony was palpable. 6 months ago, my father had threatened to sue me for everything I owned. Now he was the defendant and I was the plaintiff. I sat at the prosecution table, flanked by Sarah Jenkins and a team of federal prosecutors. I wore a navy blue suit that I had bought with my own money I earned from consulting fees I had picked up since leaving Vanguard. I looked calm. I felt calm. Across the aisle, Richard Sterling sat with his defense team. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 weeks. His silver hair, once his crowning glory, was thinning and unkempt. His skin had a gray, pasty pallor from months of house arrest and stress. He wore a suit that cost $5,000, but it hung on him like a shroud. He refused to look at me. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The Honorable Judge Marcus Thorne entered. He was a stern man, with a reputation for zero tolerance when it came to white-collar crime. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the packed courtroom. "We will proceed with the testimony of the witness for the prosecution," Judge Thorne said. "Mr. Julian Sterling." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The heavy oak doors opened, and my half-brother walked in. Julian looked terrible, but in a way that suggested he was finally sober. He had lost the bloat of alcohol. His eyes were clear, terrified, and fixed on the floor. He was wearing a simple gray suit. He walked past our father without glancing at him. Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. He was watching his golden boy, the heir apparent, walk to the stand to bury him. Julian was sworn in. He sat down, gripping the railing of the witness box until his knuckles turned white. "Mr. Sterling," the lead prosecutor, a sharp woman named Reynolds, began. "You are currently serving a suspended sentence for reckless endangerment and customs violations, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Julian whispered. "Speak up, please," Judge Thorne instructed. "Yes, ma'am," Julian repeated louder. "And as part of your plea agreement, you have agreed to testify regarding the internal operations of Vanguard Global Logistics, specifically regarding the shipment of acetic anhydride that was seized by federal agents." "Yes." "Who ordered that shipment, Mr. Sterling?" Julian took a deep breath. He looked at me for a split second. I gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. "Tell the truth," my eyes said. "It is the only thing that saves you." "My father did," Julian said. "Richard Sterling." "Liar," Richard hissed from the defense table. His lawyer grabbed his arm to silence him. "He told me that we were losing money," Julian continued, his voice gaining strength. "He told me that the client was dangerous and that we could not afford to say no. I told him we didn't have the license. Robert had deleted the licenses. I told him we would get caught." "And what was his response?" Reynolds asked. Julian swallowed hard. "He told me to stop being a coward. He said that if I didn't sign the manual override, he would cut me out of the will. He said he would leave me with nothing, just like he did to Robert. He said I had to prove I was a Sterling." "So you signed the papers under duress?" "I signed them because I was scared of him," Julian said, tears forming in his eyes. "I have been scared of him my whole life. We all are." The jury was scribbling furiously. Richard was staring at Julian with a look of pure betrayal. He couldn't understand it. He thought money bought loyalty. He didn't understand that fear only works until the person you are scaring finds someone bigger to protect them. And the federal government is much bigger than Richard Sterling. Julian stepped down. He didn't look at Richard. He walked out of the courtroom a broken young man who might finally have a chance to grow up. "The prosecution calls Robert Johnson," Reynolds announced. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the stand with the steady, rhythmic gait of a man who has nothing to hide. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. "Mr. Johnson," Reynolds said, "you were the chief operating officer of Vanguard for 10 years. You claim that you are the rightful owner of the software known as VTrack." "I am," I said. "I wrote every line of code." "And you also claim that you have evidence of Richard Sterling's criminal activities beyond the single shipment your brother testified to." "I do." "Please present this evidence to the court." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the black ledger. It was an old-fashioned, leather-bound accounting book. The leather was stained with water from the sprinkler incident, and the pages were warped, but the ink was indelible. "This," I said, holding it up, "is the shadow accounting system of Vanguard. Richard didn't trust computers for his bribes. He wrote them down. This book contains the dates, amounts, and recipients of bribes paid to customs officials in 12 different countries over a period of 20 years. I opened the book to a marked page. Page 42, I read. November 2015. $50,000 cash. Recipient Port Authority Director Lagos. Purpose bypass, radiation screening for container, X-ray 9. The courtroom was silent. This was the smoking gun. But that is not all, I continued. My father believes that because I wiped the company's servers, the digital evidence is gone. He forgets that I am a data hoarder. For the last 10 years, every time I conducted a server backup, I made a duplicate copy of the internal voice-over IP logs. I have a decade of recorded phone calls stored on a private encrypted cloud server. Richard went pale. He hadn't known about the audio. I would like to play Exhibit B, I said. Sarah Jenkins pressed a button on her laptop, which was connected to the courtroom's audio system. A voice, booming and arrogant, filled the room. It was unmistakably Richard Sterling. Audio playback. I don't care if the sensors are beeping. Arthur, just disable them. If we don't ship this copper, the cartel will kill the contract. Do you understand me? I am running this company, not you. You are just the geek in the basement. A second voice, softer and hesitant, responded. It was my Uncle Arthur. Richard, this is illegal. It's treason. If I sign off on this, I am destroying my soul. Richard's voice again. Then sell me your soul. Arthur, sign over the patents. Sign over the code. Give me everything, and I will make you rich. Or refuse, and I will make sure the board fires you for incompetence. I will ruin you, brother. I will take your creation and put my name on it. The recording ended with the sound of a heavy door slamming. I looked at the jury. That recording is dated 3 days before my Uncle Arthur died of a heart attack. Richard didn't just steal the company. He bullied his own brother into an early grave and then stole his life's work. Vanguard was never Richard's empire. It was Arthur's. Richard was just the parasite. The silence in the room was shattered by a sound that was half scream, half growl. Richard Sterling stood up. He shoved his heavy oak table, sending water pitchers crashing to the floor. You ungrateful bastard, Richard screamed. His face was purple. Veins bulged in his neck. He was foaming at the mouth. I gave you a home. I took you in when nobody wanted you. You were nothing. You are the son of a whore. Objection, Reynolds shouted. Control the defendant. I will not be silent, Richard roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are a thief, Robert. You stole my company. You stole my son. You are a stray dog I let sleep in the house, and this is how you repay me. I should have left you in the gutter where you belonged. The courtroom erupted. The bailiffs moved in, hands on their tasers. I sat in the witness box completely motionless. I did not flinch. I did not yell back. I just watched him. His outburst was not a defense. It was a confession of character. He was showing the jury exactly who he was, a narcissist, a bully, and a man capable of infinite cruelty. Your Honor, I said into the microphone, my voice calm and cutting through the chaos. I believe the defendant has just made my closing argument for me. Richard was panting, his chest heaving. He looked around the room wild-eyed. He saw the horrified faces of the jury. He saw the disgust on the judge's face. He saw the cameras recording every second of his meltdown. He realized too late that he had just walked into the final trap. Judge Thorne banged his gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. Order. The judge shouted. Mr. Sterling, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you gagged and bound to your chair. Do you understand? Richard slumped back into his seat. He looked small again, defeated. The evidence presented by the plaintiff is overwhelming. Judge Thorne said, his voice cold steel. And the defendant's conduct in this courtroom displays a shocking lack of remorse and a volatile temperament consistent with the accusations of coercion. The judge shuffled his papers. Regarding the civil suit, I am issuing a summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff, Robert Johnson. The intellectual property rights to VTrack and all associated algorithms are hereby returned to RJ Solutions. Vanguard Global Logistics is ordered to pay restitution for 10 years of unauthorized use, an amount to be determined by a forensic audit. Richard put his head in his hands. For who? Furthermore, the judge continued, turning his attention to the criminal case. Given the severity of the crimes, arms trafficking, bribery of foreign officials, and massive tax fraud, and given the defendant's clear flight risk and access to offshore funds, I am taking an unprecedented step. He looked directly at Richard. I am hereby ordering the immediate freezing of all assets held by Richard Sterling, Eleanor Sterling, and the Vanguard Corporation. This includes all domestic accounts, real estate, and the contents of the trusts. I am also issuing a warrant for the seizure of the assets identified in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Sterling, you are leaving this courtroom with nothing but the clothes on your back. Your Honor, Richard's lawyer protested weakly. That is unconstitutional. It is justice, Judge Thorne snapped. Bail is revoked. The defendant is remanded to federal custody immediately. The gavel banged one last time. Bang. It was over. Two marshals moved in behind Richard. They pulled him up from his chair. They pulled his arms behind his back. I heard the distinct click-click of handcuffs. Richard didn't fight them. He looked up, his eyes searching the room until they found mine. There was no anger left in his eyes, just a terrible, haunting realization. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a rusty screw. He didn't see a tool. He saw the man who had beaten him. Robert, he whispered. It wasn't a plea. It was just a name. I didn't answer. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and turned my back on him. I walked toward the exit. The reporters were shouting questions at me. Mr. Johnson, how does it feel to take down your own father? Robert, what will you do with the company? Is it true you are worth $1 billion now? I ignored them all. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the hallway. Sarah was right behind me. You okay? She asked, touching my arm. I am fine, I said. I took a deep breath. The air in the hallway was just processed air, but it felt cleaner than it had in years. He called you a stray dog, Sarah said quietly. He was wrong, I said. I wasn't the stray. I was the one holding the leash, and I just let go. We walked down the long marble corridor toward the elevators. Behind us, the sounds of the courtroom faded away. The shouting, the gavel, the shuffling of feet. Vanguard was gone. The money was frozen. Richard was going to prison for the rest of his natural life. Julian was ruined. Eleanor was destitute. I had burned the empire down to the bedrock. Now, all that was left was the ash. And ash, as any farmer will tell you, is excellent fertilizer for something new. Come on, Sarah, I said, pressing the down button. I want to buy you lunch. I know a place that serves noodles for more than 45 cents, she smiled. I would like that. The elevator arrived. We stepped in, and the doors closed, shutting out the past forever. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in the federal courthouse, but the echoes of that sound still seemed to vibrate through the streets of Chicago. Time, I have learned, is the only true judge. The legal system gives you a sentence, but time gives you the reality. For Richard Sterling, the reality was a 6 by 8 foot cell at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute. The judge had not been lenient. 25 years. Given that Richard was 65 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. He was no longer the titan of logistics. He was inmate number 49201. There were no cashmere blankets there. There were no smart home systems to control the temperature. There was just concrete steel and the endless crushing regret of a man who had gambled his family and lost. I did not visit him. I had no desire to see the lion in the cage. The man who had looked at me with such disdain in the courtroom was gone, replaced by a ghost who spent his days writing appeal letters that would never be read. Julian fared slightly better, though the definition of better is relative. His testimony against our father had earned him mercy from the court, but not from society. He received 5 years of probation and a mandatory 2-year stay in a state-run rehabilitation facility. It was not a luxury spa in Malibu. It was a grim, austere place where he had to scrub floors and attend group therapy sessions. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Julian was actually doing well. For the first time in his life, he did not have a father telling him he was a disappointment or a mother telling him he was a prince. He was just a guy named Julian trying to stay sober. In a strange way, by destroying his life, I might have actually saved it. Then there was Eleanor. The Queen of Chicago society had fallen the hardest. With the assets frozen and then seized to pay the massive federal fines and the civil judgment to my company, Eleanor was left with nothing. The Sterling Manor was seized by the government. The cars were towed. The accounts were drained. She was not in prison, but she was in purgatory. Last week, I walked past a high-end consignment shop on Michigan Avenue. I saw her through the window. She was arguing with the clerk about the price of a diamond brooch, the same brooch she had worn to the 50th anniversary party. She looked tired. Her hair was graying at the roots because she could no longer afford the stylist. She was living in a small, rented studio apartment in the suburbs, selling off the remnants of her former life, one piece of jewelry at a time, just to buy groceries. I did not go in. I did not gloat. Her punishment was her irrelevance. She had defined herself by her possessions, and without them, she was invisible. The entity known as Vanguard Global Logistics suffered a similar fate. It was a carcass picked clean by vultures. The board of directors dissolved the company 2 weeks after the verdict. The assets were broken up and sold at a public auction to satisfy the creditors. The ships were sold to Maersk. The trucks were sold to independent contractors. The warehouses were bought by Amazon. And then there was the headquarters, the Vanguard Tower, 50 stories of glass and steel in the heart of the financial district. It was the physical manifestation of Richard's ego. It stood empty, a dark monolith in the skyline. No one wanted to buy it. The brand was toxic. The building was associated with fraud, drug trafficking, and failure. The real estate agents called it a cursed asset. So the price dropped, and dropped, and dropped, until yesterday. I stood in the auction house, wearing jeans and a black t-shirt. I held paddle number 7. "Do I hear 40 million?" The auctioneer asked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Silence. 35 million. Silence. 30 million, ladies and gentlemen, this is a prime location. The land value alone is worth that. I raised my paddle. 20 million. The auctioneer looked at me. He recognized me. Everyone did. I was the man who had burned the empire down. And now, I was standing in the ashes with a checkbook. "I have 20 million from the gentleman in the back," the auctioneer said, sounding relieved to have any bid at all. "Do I hear 21? No one moved. Going once, going twice. Sold. I bought the tower for pennies on the dollar. And the sweetest irony of all was that I bought it using the money Richard had been forced to pay me in the copyright settlement. He had essentially paid for his own eviction. Today was the first day of the new era. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building. Scaffolding covered the entrance. A team of workers was up on cranes removing the giant silver letters that spelled Vanguard. As the V came down, swinging slowly in the wind, a feeling of lightness washed over me. It was not happiness exactly. It was the feeling of putting down a heavy backpack after hiking for 1,000 miles. "Careful with that," a foreman shouted. "Bring up the new sign," I ordered. The crane lowered hooking onto the new letters I had commissioned. They were modest, made of brushed bronze, not flashy silver. They did not scream for attention. They simply stated a fact. Arthur Tower. I named it for the man who should have run this place. My Uncle Arthur, the man who taught me code, the man who taught me that quiet competence is more powerful than loud arrogance. This building would no longer be a monument to greed. It would be an incubator for tech startups, a hub for logistics innovation, a place where the system was designed to help people, not exploit them. I walked through the lobby. It still smelled of Richard's cigar smoke, faint but persistent. I would have the carpets replaced tomorrow. I took the elevator to the roof. The wind on the 50th floor was ferocious. It whipped my coat around my legs, carrying the bite of the coming winter. Chicago spread out below me like a circuit board glowing with millions of lights. I walked to the edge and looked down. 6 months ago, I had walked out of a hotel ballroom into the cold, thinking I was finished. I had nothing but a badge, a set of keys, and a phone. Now I owned the skyline. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was not the burner phone. I didn't use burners anymore. It was my personal device. I looked at the screen. It was a text message from a number I did not recognize. I opened it. "You have won. Are you happy?" I knew who it was. Richard. He must have bribed a guard or smuggled a phone into the prison. It was a violation that could add time to his sentence, but he couldn't help himself. He had to know. He needed to know if his suffering had purchased my joy. I stared at the words. Are you happy? Happiness was a strange word. Was I happy that my father was in a cage? No. Was I happy that my brother was broken? No. But was I at peace? Yes. I did not type a reply. There was nothing left to say to Richard Sterling. Any word I sent him would just be oxygen for his narcissism. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to gloat so he could feel like a victim. He wanted me to apologize so he could feel like a god. I gave him neither. I pressed delete. Then I went to the settings and blocked the number. I looked at the phone in my hand. It was the last link, the last tether to the old life. I walked to the parapet. I extended my arm over the edge, suspending the device over the 500-foot drop. I opened my hand. The phone tumbled end over end, flashing in the sunlight for a brief second before disappearing into the abyss of the city below. I took a deep breath. The air was crisp and clean. You really threw it. I turned around. Sarah Jenkins was standing by the roof access door. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. She had been with me every step of the way. She was the one who drove the getaway car. She was the one who filed the motions. She was the only person in the world who knew the full code. I did, I said. She walked over and handed me a coffee. It was an expensive phone. It was a cheap price to pay for silence, I replied. We stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at Lake Michigan. The water was gray and choppy, relentless in its motion. I heard the sign went up, Sarah said. Arthur would have hated it. He hated attention. He would have hated the font, I admitted, with a small smile. But he would have loved the irony. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. So what? Now, Robert, you have the building. You have the capital. You have the reputation of being the most dangerous man in logistics. What do you do for an encore? We rebuild, I said. But we do it right this time. No black ledgers. No hidden servers. No ghost ships. We build a system that works. It will be hard, Sarah warned. People are afraid of you. Good, I said. Fear keeps people honest, but respect keeps them working. I don't want to be loved, Sarah. I just want to be effective. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face. You know that night at the party when Julian made that toast? I remember, I said. He said you wouldn't last a week, Sarah said softly. I looked down at the street where the ants were scurrying about their business. I thought about the cold nights in the motel. I thought about the noodles. I thought about the look on Eleanor's face when the money ran out. I thought about the water pouring down on Richard in the archives. They said I wouldn't last a week without them. I said, my voice low, but steady against the wind. They thought I was dependent on their money, their power, their name. But they forgot one thing. I turned to Sarah, and for the first time in years, I felt a genuine smile touch my face. I am the one who built that week, I said. I built the days. I built the hours, I controlled the clock. They were just living in the time I gave them. Sarah smiled back. And now? Now, I said, turning away from the edge. We start the clock on something new. I offered her my arm. Shall we go downstairs? I have an empty office that needs a desk. I am expensive, Mr. Johnson, Sarah teased. I can afford you, I replied. We walked toward the elevator. The metal doors slid open with a smooth chime. We stepped inside. As the doors closed, shutting out the wind and the cold, I didn't look back at the view. I didn't look back at the past. I pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator began to descend, carrying us down to the ground floor where the work was waiting. The fire was out. The ashes were cold. It was time to plant the garden. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the freezing streets of Chicago to the top of Arthur Tower, and I appreciate you sticking with Robert until the very end. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a bustling city like Chicago, or somewhere quiet and remote? Please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Robert's Revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel Calm Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply building something better.